Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in strong opposition to H.R. 2925 and would like to remind my friends across the aisle that mining is already happening on American lands and on our public lands. But this week, instead of working on meaningful legislation on behalf of the American people, our friends have opted instead to focus on a toxic free-for-all on our public lands, have opted to focus on legislation to roll back energy efficiency in home appliances. In fact, they put forward a bill this week called Hands Off Our Home Appliances because they're so concerned about the American people that they want to regulate the efficiency of your toasters, your dishwashers, your refrigerators, and undermine the ability of our immigrant and our Hispano communities to have representation in the United States Senate and United States Census, and yes, to allow a free-for-all on our public lands. Now, the American people are not asking us to do this. They are asking us to work on real problems, to work on the economy, inflation, helping families put food on the table and a roof over their head, protecting our reproductive rights and access to the ballot box, protecting our democracy, and dealing with the international crises that are happening on multiple continents. So my question is, why the heck are we back on the House floor 1 week? Yeah, that's right. 1 week after we voted on a bipartisan basis to send this bad bill back to committee because it couldn't even be supported on the floor once. But yet here we are, and our friends are trying to pass it once again without revision, without changes, because they think they found a few extra spare votes. But let's talk about mining laws. The existing mining law of 1872 already gives our mining companies, including foreign-owned companies, the right to extract on our publicly owned lands. They can also do so without having to pay even 1 cent in royalties. That includes companies that are controlled by governments of adversarial nations. This is not only a shameful giveaway, but a huge national security vulnerability for the United States. But this bill is not about clarifying a court decision. It's about giving more minerals away to those who would like unfettered access to our public lands. It would give the opportunity for multinational corporations and adversarial nations to control even more of our resources without having to pay royalties to the U.S. government and to tie up claims on our public lands, whether or not there are minerals actually present there. This would make it impossible to invalidate a mining claim, even if their real intent was other things, maybe to lock up development of other uses or buying them for other uses, including construction of transmission lines or other things that they would want to do. This should be of deep concern to anyone who does not want adversarial nations or the companies that operate in them to control our public lands or minerals. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle argue that it's either mine here or mine abroad, and create a false equivalency, but it's not that simple. Some of the countries that are trying to expand their mining operations here in the United States, in fact, many of these multinational corporations, are owned as subsidiaries under countries like China and other countries that we have adversarial relationships with. They also engage in practices that we know cause human rights abuses, things like slave labor elsewhere in the world. And while my friends across the aisle have tried to claim that this is really about mining on American lands, it's about granting unfettered access to these corporations. In fact, these entities can ship the minerals that they take from American lands anywhere in the world and smelt those materials on the cheap, also relying on human rights abuses abroad to cut costs. Now, as I said, we already had this debate last week, and the outcome was that the entire House, right here on this floor, voted to send this toxic bill back to the Natural Resources Committee. In fact, that hadn't happened in years because this bill was so flawed and such a giveaway to foreign national-owned companies and a threat to our national security that it was agreed that it wasn't ready for prime time and shouldn't be passed on the floor. My colleague from New Mexico, Representative Teresa Ledger Fernandez, offered a motion to send the bill back to committee so that we could discuss amending the bill to ban these adversarial corporations operated in adversarial nations from mining and locking up our public lands. And I have to say, I was heartened. We had 6 Republicans join the Democrats to do just that, who said, you know what, we're not going to vote for this bill. Well, it's about time. We need some bipartisan support to double down in protecting U.S. interests. In fact, as I said, it's been decades since the House sent a bill back to committee like that. But as we see today, here we are, and Republican leadership is trying once again to get the bill passed through brute force without addressing serious concerns, without sending it back to committee, without going through due process, and here we are debating it, about to take a vote again. Now, these concerns aren't new. Last year, the bill was included in H.R. 1, and at that time, one of my Republican colleagues offered a very similar amendment, banning mining on our public lands by foreign companies with records of human rights violations. And we're literally talking about companies that have child slave labor records. But that amendment passed through committee on bipartisan basis, but yet they stripped it out and are trying to pass the bill without it here today on the floor. So I just find it absolutely jaw-dropping and extremely telling that this was the amendment that was stripped out of the bill, that we're here back a week later after this bill failed on the floor. And I think it's very clear what is going on here. This is really about advancing the interests of corporations, of interests on our public lands, and opening them up for exploitation. So I think it's important that we talk about how outrageous this is. We have to ensure that our public lands are not open to our adversaries, to these multinational corporations that will exploit our minerals for free. And we need some bipartisan action to make sure that that cannot happen. We should be back in committee discussing the vulnerabilities, discussing the national security implications, discussing American competitiveness, discussing energy policy, not trying to jam through a bill that will violate human rights and international trade. And with that, I reserve.
The gentlelady reserves. The gentleman